Hello everybody, welcome to the AHDB webinar. So we're here today, we've got James Breen with us and Richard Twose, who is one of our strategic dairy farmers over in West Wales in Pembrokeshire. So we're going to be discussing the role of vaccination in herd health management, working on the premise that healthy cows result in profitable cows. So we'll be focusing a little bit on general information that's certainly relevant to all, and then we'll also be moving on to talk with Richard specifically about how they approach their vaccination planning, their herd health planning at Maenhir farm. So yeah, huge thanks to you both for being here with us today, and I'm very aware that we've got Richard with us today, but there is a whole farm team that work alongside Richard, so I suppose we should really give special mention to Joe and Joseph and Jen and Yuan, because although Richard's the face of today, I think there's probably plenty of other people that are involved in the day-to-day herd management. So thanks, Richard, particularly.
No problem.
Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. So I'm Jamie and I work at AHDB. I'll be taking your questions as we go through the webinar today. So hopefully you can see the slide, which just helps you understand how you can ask a question. So there's an orange arrow in the top right-hand corner of your screen, which if you click that out, it shows a control panel. If you slide down to where it says questions, you can use that little arrow to open the question box. You can type your questions into there and we'll be able to ask them as we go along. Os hoffech chi'n gofyn unrhyw cwestiynau yn Gymraeg, mae croeso i chi. So the language of today's webinar will be in English, but if you'd like to ask any questions in Welsh, you are very, very welcome to do so. And if you're collecting dairy points, then please do type your details into the questions box and we will make sure that you're accredited with the relevant points. Just one final little thing from me before we get into the meat of today. AHDB are having an opportunity for levy payers to shape the future of how AHDB works, and we really plea you to register to have a vote or to have your say. So if you could visit the website that's on the screen now, or alternatively, if it's easier for you, you're very welcome to type your trading name, telephone number, and also the number of litres that you produce every year, and I'm more than happy to register for you on your behalf. Okay, we'll come across now to you, James. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invite.
On to vaccinations.
Okay. So hopefully you can see that, Jamie and Richard. Good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come on to the webinar this morning. Having met Richard last year, it was really nice to meet up with him again and have a chance to address some of his questions. And Richard, very much your thoughts were around having some sort of meeting about vaccine use in dairy herds. So we've put our heads together and thought about giving this morning just what we plan to do. Richard and I will say a little bit in terms of background about ourselves and about the aims of this session. We're going to chop it up into 3 bits, if you like. I'm going to talk a little bit about vaccination in dairy herds generally. So why, what are our options? What are we trying to achieve? We can have a little bit in the middle about perhaps some of the barriers to using vaccination, whether that's trying to comply with the data sheet, trying to store the vaccines correctly, trying to have sort of some appreciation of what the vaccines are trying to do, but also that they can't do everything, if you like. And also, of course, the cost benefit, that'll come into barriers to using vaccinations. And then really want to get into some discussion with Richard at Maenhir in terms of what their current protocols are, but also some lab test results and some other discussions around other areas we think we could perhaps benefit from using a vaccine protocol. and obviously very happy to take questions as we go, and I'm sure Jamie will interrupt, and Richard and I will try and answer as we go along. So if that's all right, Richard, over to you. Do you want to say good morning and a few things about yourself?
Yes, good morning then. Yeah, I'm Richard Twose, a farm here at Maenhir, which is on the Commandership-Pembrokeshire border. We're a family, very much a family-oriented farm with 3 families living off the farm. We've got 400 pedigree Holstein cows. My son has also got some shorthorn, dairy shorthorns that are milked within that same numbers, and my nephew then, Joe, he's got a small herd of Herefords as well. We're all year round calving, try with an autumn bias, and I say autumn bias in as much as that we like our heifer calves born from the beginning of June then to December. We're not really looking for many heifer calves past then. And then of course we're calving a 2-year-old, so we'll start all those heifers calving in June and finish them by Christmas. We're currently 9,000 litres, 3.39, 3.4, something like that. Fat is slightly higher at the moment, 4.12. It's a little bit higher than that at the moment. Cell counts, we've seen a significant drop in cell counts over the last 9 to 10 months. Then since about April, we were running around about 190, always struggling to get under that 200. A note for December, we were 123, and for January just finished, we're 112 on our cell count. So some of that is what we've done with the dry cow management, being a bit more ruthless with these cows that we probably should have got rid of before. We used only sex semen for black and white semen then, and with beef, we was in the range of Angus and Blue, and of course the Herefords. Average age of calving about 23.5 months. We like to calve them young and grow them whilst they milk.
As the average age at first calving is very tight, Richard. Is under very good control when you look at the distribution, of heifer calving age. So to get the average at 23.5 months is very good. Going on to the calves, you talked about the heifer calves and things. You're doing a few nice things since we met up. Do you want to talk people through what you do with the calves?
Yeah. Some of this is you see the balls, the blue balls there, then for engagement with calves, and how they really work well in as much as when you feed the calves, you fed them, and then they run and chase these balls, and they're just hanging down. They were about £37 a piece then, plus a bit of rope and a chain, and you can hear them, from outside the calf shed. You can hear them knocking and banging them. It's really made the calves, I don't know, a lot lively, a lot healthier in some ways. Then they've got, they're attentive. That's the thing. New thing for us, this we've always used jackets, or have in the past. We get a lot of trouble here with starlings being in West Wales. Jackets were always horrible, and with the crypto sort of trying to wash the jackets and get rid of the crypto, then for the new calf, I know we need 90 degrees to wash the jackets, the calf jackets in. So James, I don't know, when he was here in June, July, we talked about infrared lamps. That's just what we've rigged up over those double pens there. We've got all the young calves up to about 3 weeks old are on infrared lights. We found there's 2 stages. There's a sort of half heat and full heat, and we've been on that since all of December and January. Okay, we haven't really had a lot of cold weather, but we found that the calves are a lot sharper. And if you've got something that is possibly scouring a bit loose and needs a powder or rehydration, you can put it on full power. It's still alive in the morning. So we've it's quite good. As far as energy consumption and all the rest of it, well, we're washing those washing the jackets at 90 degrees. There's quite a bit there. With calves are healthier. I think there's a very equal sort of consumption of energy sort of thing compared to the lights compared to washing and putting the phosphates down the river and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Richard. I'd be really keen to share some of the pictures you shared with me with Bobby Hyde and the group at Nottingham University, because the active heating, Bobby's just published a big randomized clinical trial. And I know Bobby's been on an AHDB webinar before talking about sort of calf health and average daily live weight gain, but active heating in the first few weeks of life, like you're doing there, actually likely to be really important. So really interested to hear your comments about that, and it'd be really interesting to see how they go on. But excellent.
Yeah.
Good. What about the dry cows? You mentioned something about the dry cows, Richard, a bit earlier on. What have you been doing with dry cow management?
Yeah, dry cow management, I think, is just paying more attention to keeping it clean, keeping the calving box clean. That all the dry cows are housed all year round, and as soon as they go dry, they don't go out to grass or anything like that. Yeah, so just a bit more attention to that. We did try a little bit of sand in the calving box, but we found, I don't know whether we're a damp atmosphere being west or whatever, it was always very, very damp. So I think what the focus is keeping the box a lot cleaner. You see, the calving box isn't very big. We calve 400 or 500 cows through there, which isn't it isn't a very big area, because if you look at it, that's a 12-foot trough there. It's about 15 foot wide and 30 foot long. So you know, there's always a fast throughput there on that sort of things. But yeah, just paying more attention. And cell counts. Yeah, cell counts have changed tremendously over the last 9 months.
But I know you commented you might have got rid of a few sort of chronically high cell count cows, as it were, but actually what you've done with the dry cow management, you can measure that, and it's quite demonstrable. You know, you've really dropped the rate at which cows calve in with a high cell count, and really good to measure, and really good to see the impact of what you've done with the dry cows, because that'll be the reason why your cell count's improved. You know, you can see the reduction in new infections. Really interesting. And how about your lactating cow management? Obviously, the housing, you've got your older sheds on the left, and this is your nice new sort of canopy style shed on the right.
Yeah, with you know, since we left school, we found my parents, and it was always Twose Farms Limited that were the builders, and they milked the cows as well. So it was always wood and build them sheds between milking, sort of thing. But as cow numbers have increased, we've struggled to sort of build ourselves. So yeah, 12 months ago, or in the last 12 months, then we put this shed in that will hold. That unit will hold 125 fresh cows, and you can't really see them, but they've got these zigzag head rails there. And they're on mattresses then, Timor mattresses then, and yeah, we try, and that's the high yield is or the fresh calvers in there. There's 125 in there. The idea is to get them all in calf before they go out into a bigger group of 250. We do house our calved heifers separately through the winter. There's normally a group of around 80 heifers on their own. It works really, really well. We've done that for 3 seasons. It's a pleasure PD in that group then of heifers, because you know, they've calved 40 days, calved at, well, starting off calved at 23 months, calved 40 days, you PD AI them, PD them, and they're in calf, and you wonder why you struggle with the cows, because the heifers are so much easier to get in calf then. But I suppose that does help with genetic gain as well.
Yeah, good. So I'm conscious of time, but it's really nice to sort of hear what's going on the farm. I thought I'd get a picture of you, Anne, in. Jamie name checked him earlier on. Here he is, hard at it in the parlour. And just to reiterate, you know, with your cell count and your clinical mastitis, you know, udder health is good on the unit. Do you want to just walk people through what happens in the parlour very quickly? Yeah,
there's a, you can't really see it there, but there's a 50-50 Westphalia or GEA parlour then with the ADF. We're all involved in milking, but I think the picture there is of Yuan drying cows off. My wife Jennifer then and my son Yuan are totally involved with the drying off. They sort out what they're drying the cows off with for selective dry cow management, etc. And when they're drying cows off, cows are milked and then brought back through and milked and dried off, and then we stand the cows then for probably a couple of hours then before they are dosed and back in with the dry cows then. But yeah, the milking routine, or very stringent at drying off then, that we've got everything clean and tidy, because we have had it the other way and we've lost cows through not being clean enough when we're just using teat sealants.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I had the opportunity to chat with Jennifer and Yuan and go through the protocol, and certainly, you know, what you're doing with teat prep, you know, is excellent. I just thought, I know this is not a mastitis webinar and I'll shut up in a minute, but I thought you might be interested to know if you put your data, your cell count data and your clinical mastitis data through the new AHDB pattern tool. So this is part of the Waterproof scheme. People may on the call may have heard of it. But you can see the reduction in the dry period if you're a contribution to your cell count clinical mastitis. So really nice, all that work you've done with dry cows, starting with drying off and through the dry cow management and the calving box management, means now the dry period is contributing a lot less in terms of the overall pattern, and you're now very much an environmental mastitis in lactation type pattern, you know, so back to things like the cubicles and the yards and that sort of thing. But no, really good, and really nice to have the chance to catch up with you about that after we talked about it, you know, last summer. Thanks, Richard. Just very quickly about me. So I qualified out of a vet as a vet out of Bristol, late 90s. I am actually Welsh. I'm from Newport originally, so I'm a Newport boy. Still go back home because mum was in Newport. Still a frustrated Dragon supporter, and obviously quite worried about this Saturday at Dublin. We could talk about that for quite some time, but we won't. I'm still in practice in Glastonbury. I work with University of Nottingham Veterinary School some of my time, and I'm also a veterinary advisor with Map of Ag, and we provide support for Sainsbury's dairy farmers, Arla 360 dairy farmers, as well as other things. And I got asked to get involved with Richard as part of the AHDB Strategic Dairy Farm Programme, and really interesting heading out west. I normally get quite nervous about heading out west because it means the Dragons are going to get thumped by the Scarlets again, but it was nice to see you, Richard, on a non-rugby event. I've been asked to say something about vaccination today. So in terms of dairy herd health, you know, there's lots of areas of dairy herd health. So clearly we're much more focused on infectious disease control, and particularly single agent infectious disease control today. So that's where that sits. Just as a sort of a start of a 10 before we go into sort of vaccines, I think when you're thinking about any single agent infectious disease, be it IBR, BVD, Johne's, you know, whatever it is, you know, for each one, you know, with your veterinary surgeon, you know, it's what Richard does with his vets. Really, for each one, we almost want to work through, right, what's the current status? You know, are we infected? Are we free? Is there evidence of active infection? What's our ongoing surveillance and monitoring? You know, are we tissue testing calves? You know, are we monitoring the bulk milk? Are we picking up some poo off the floor from young heifers at grazing for, you know, worm egg counts? You know, what sort of things are we doing to monitor? What's our risk assessment? Are we a totally closed herd? You know, no natural service? You know, or are we buying in? You know, what about boundaries? What about access with grazing? What about nose-to-nose contact with other stock? You know, all that sort of thing comes into risk assessment. And then do we have some sort of ongoing action plan for control? Or if it's not control, is it actually eradication? Or is it actually, yeah, we're free of it, so it's prevention? You know, those three things are quite different. Preventing something coming onto the unit, eradicating something that we've got, or essentially living with it and controlling it. And so, for example, you know, the viral type things, so BVD virus, IBR virus, those are really good candidates to get rid of if you so wished. You know, you can actually get rid of those things out of the herd. Whereas other things, you know, you talk about lepto, you talk about Johne's disease, you talk about some of the sort of viral pneumonia type things, RSV, you know, they're very unlikely you could actually get rid of those, you know, for a number of reasons. So it's more about controlling, you know, and minimizing, you know, the impact that they have. So that's where we sort of started from, Richard and I, with our chats. And that led me into sort of thinking, well, as a starter for 10, this morning, we would just talk very briefly about vaccination in more general terms. So this is the first chunk, if you like, and because there's so many vaccines, and this was sort of Richard's comment to me, was it's almost an overwhelming number. How do you know which ones you're supposed to be using, and that sort of thing. And of course, it's very herd specific, isn't it? We're talking about I in this. Which ones do I need? What am I trying to achieve on my farm? And does vaccination have a role to play in that? And that leads me on to saying, well, really an approach to the use of vaccines, and this was my old boss and mentor, Andrew Bradley. He used to explain this to the Bristol veterinary students in this sort of terms. There's four main approaches, if you like. If you're going to think about using a vaccine, is it because you're in the face of an outbreak, if you like, severe infection, an outbreak style situation where rapidly vaccinating the remaining stock might be very important? An example of that was, when blue tongue happened, a few years ago. If you remember, the midge plumes came over from Northern Europe into the southeast of England, and there was much debate about how far west would this come, and would you actually, sort of in the face of a potential outbreak, vaccinate your stock. You could also talk about control, for some of these major endemic things that are actually very difficult to control without a vaccine. So, BVD is a very good example in this case. Leptospirosis is another good one. That's why we're using the vaccine. A lot of people use vaccines as some sort of management package, where the vaccine is not the key thing. So calf pneumonia would be a good example here. It's not the key intervention, because you can't do vaccination and nothing else, but as part of a package of things that you do, in other areas, well, then it might have a role. And the fourth and last one, which, let's be honest, sometimes it is a bit like this. Vaccines are an insurance, something sporadic, a sort of a just in case type scenario. Well, we're going to vaccinate because if the worst happens, it could be quite a disaster. So just to illustrate those in a bit more detail, I'm sure Richard will chip in as you see fit, Richard. But in the face of disease outbreak, the sort of things I was thinking about, classically was IBR, particularly the up the nose ones, very rapid immunity. Any thoughts about IBR in your herd? I know we'll talk about it a bit later.
Yeah, IBR, as long as we keep vaccinating, we don't see the snotty noses as such then. So it's always there, yeah. And we're quite stock heavy in this area. Then there's a lot of areas around, and and all that sort of stuff. So we're trying just to control it and keep it at bay, really.
But you've never had the sort of very severe disease. You can have losses. You can have quite severe forms of IBR. You've never experienced that. No. Classically described, for example, if people buy in, so if you brought in a batch of heifers that were completely naive, and if you happen to have circulating IBR in the herd, the incoming animals could go down with quite a severe form of disease. It works the other way, of course. You could buy in animals that were shedding, and your herd was completely naive, and your own stock could go down with quite severe disease. But in the face of an outbreak, IBR is one potential thing. Sorry, Richard.
When we built parlour, put the new parlour in about 10 years ago, we were looking to expand the herd, and I presume that's about that sort of time we started with the IBR. We were buying cows in and just trying to protect our own and the ones that are coming in. That's really why we started.
I see. Yes. So it wasn't in the face of an outbreak, but it was more of a just in case type approach. Okay. Yeah. The other one I was going to put in this bracket, and people on the call may sort of have their own experiences with this, but severe clinical mastitis events. People talk about E. coli mastitis. I know what they mean. You're talking about the sort of the very sick cows, and you can sometimes experience runs of this or herds with quite high prevalence, of sort of very severe clinical cases, and that's where, in the face of not really an outbreak, but in the face of apparently a high prevalence of sick cows, you could, vaccinate dry cows, and try and reduce the risk of that. And here's IBR, the classic conjunctivitis, pink eye, and the discharge. Obviously the toxic cow. I have to put her in. She's from Glastonbury years ago. She lives on in virtually every presentation Martin Green, Andrew Bradley, or I do. Just on the mastitis events, there is research. So, for example, using E. coli mastitis vaccine to reduce the risk of a sick cow, that is based on research that was done in the UK. Doesn't stop them becoming infected, but reduces significantly the risk of severe disease. So in some of these situations, there is evidence around this. So in the face of an outbreak is one. Clearly, for a lot of people on the call, you're generally using vaccines to control something major, and I'm sure you're like this, Richard. So the importance of vaccination, because it's very difficult to do something other than that. BVD virus, leptospirosis. I mean, lepto is an absolute classic. It's so difficult to control wildlife reservoirs, water courses, grazing, that actually if you didn't vaccinate for lepto, you could leave yourself open. Is that your experience, why you've always vaccinated for lepto?
Yes, yeah, just never had a problem with it, but just to keep ourselves safe, basically, and our staff safe as well.
That's a very good point. Yeah, very good point, actually, because of course that's zoonotic. Humans can, catch infection, lepto infection. It'd be really nasty. But things like BVD and lepto, the vaccine is such a central component of control. It's almost impossible to control without use of the vaccine. You could put IBR in this category for high prevalence, endemically infected herds that experience problems with IBR. Well, the vaccine suddenly becomes a lot more important in those situations. There are some others that fall into this category. You could argue Salmonella would come here, for herds which are infected, and find it very difficult to control Salmonella type outbreaks, particularly Dublin. Particularly in the past, they might have bought in cows. Well, Salmonella vaccine maybe is a role here. Lungworm, you could argue, in herds which experience a high risk, high prevalence, actually controlling lungworm without vaccine in these sorts of herds is difficult. Neospora would be great if we had one, but there is no vaccine for Neospora, but that would be another obvious candidate, where it's quite difficult to control Neospora infections for quite a few herds. So that's that sort of bit. The third category, people tend to think about vaccines to help manage some endemic diseases. So the vaccine is not the be all and end all, and we need to be very careful that we remember this. I think sometimes it maybe is held up as being it, but these are situations where the importance of the environment is really key, and we use vaccines to sort of help us move towards somewhere. So scour events, neonatal scours, diarrhea in calves, where the vaccine will have a role to play, but you can't manage it, with nothing else. Respiratory disease in calves is a classic, where vaccination, yes, can be important, not saying it isn't, and for some herds it might be more important, but other things around building design, energy intake in the calves, alleviation of cold stress will be much more important. And the mastitis vaccines will come here. That they maybe are part of a package, but clearly environment management is really important. And just to signpost Bobby Hyde's calf stuff, so Richard talked about the heat lamps earlier on. Bobby's produced this. This is AHDB funded research, which is why I'm always quite keen to sort of put this in front of audiences. But if you look at things like average daily live weight gain, environmental temperature in young calves, minimizing group changes in very young calves, getting lots of milk into them, and we still see people feeding 5 or 6 litres a day and no more. Generally, that's not enough. These are the things that are really important. And then you build perhaps your vaccine use on top of that. The fourth category I mentioned was insurance against disease. So very familiar, sheep farmers will be very familiar with this, but the cost benefit is going to be very high. The potential for losses is huge for some things. The cost of the vaccine tends to be relatively small. The Clostridial diseases are a classic here. Blackleg, for example, tetanus. BVD you could put here actually for herds that have eradicated BVD, got rid of PIs, gone through several years of screening, there's no evidence of active infection, gone through all the biosecurity. It's interesting, for some reason, maybe not particularly well understood in some, as BVD virus appears to get back in again. So very much in this situation, continuing vaccination is almost trying to prevent re-establishment of infection, and it is that insurance. Lungworm, insurance again. Sorry, Richard, go on, jump in.
Yeah, James, I was talking the BVD to prevent establishment. I think that's probably the reason we use it. 25 years ago, we had mucosal disease in heifers and lost, 5 to 10 in a bunch, and we've been vaccinating for BVD ever since that time then. Yes. And in those days it was very, very expensive. But today we tag and test, and we haven't picked up a negative, a positive one for 5, 6, 7 years sort of thing, but we're still using that vaccine then. The other thing, James, on the vaccinating calves with diarrhea and scour, I presume you're talking about dosing the cows, the rotavirus type thing. Is that the way you're talking about that?
Absolutely, yes. Sorry, right. Yeah. Point well made, Richard. Yes, of course, you're absolutely right. You vaccinate the dam, don't you, and then try and boost the colostral antibody. But of course, then you need to get that colostrum into the calf. So there's a lot of moving parts with that, isn't there? But you're absolutely right. These are the classic Rotavex, Bovigens, those sorts of things where you're vaccinating the dam in late pregnancy. Yes.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, good. And absolutely echo your comments about BVD there. Yes.
James, just before you move on, we've had another question come in, and I think it's relevant to ask now, really.
Yeah.
People are asking about when you're using a vaccine as a management tool, or maybe to eradicate a particular problem. At what point can you decide that it's possible to stop using that vaccine? Or are you then just committed forever? That herd will need to be vaccinated, or boosted, or however you call it, forever?
It's a really, really good question, isn't it? When, if, do you ever stop? So the BVD one, I think that's an interesting one, because as Richard said, there are examples where herds have eradicated it, become free, are checks accredited, BVD free England, whatever it is, and then infection has come back in, by whatever route. So you could argue in that situation, I think it's incredibly difficult to stop vaccinating, because even if the biosecurity is as tight as you can make it, I think it's quite difficult. In terms of other things, so IBR would be one. You could argue you could get to a situation where there's no evidence of active infection. You're completely closed. There's no nose-to-nose contact. You go through all the biosecurity type things, because IBR is aerosol, nose-to-nose contact particularly. And you say, well, actually now, do I stop vaccinating because I've achieved my end goal? If I don't need to do it for, I'm not selling animals, I'm not exporting, I'm not, do I carry on vaccinating for IBR? And that might be one where you could stop or have an end goal of stopping. I think the as part of a package type ones, if you're thinking about neonatal scour, calf pneumonia, I think if you're doing it on top of some management, but it seems like you can't do it through management alone, it might be very difficult for you to stop. But there are herds which don't use those vaccines and achieve very high levels of calf sort of health and performance, without vaccination. But then you're into, generally it's very, very environment focused, and those are the sorts of herds where they might have almost started again with calf housing and calf management and said, right, we just can't do it with the existing buildings we have or pens, and we've gone polytunnels, or we've gone hutches, or we've redesigned things completely, and we've almost started again. But it's also worth saying, of course, that these sorts of things do change, and you may have a strain of mycoplasma, you may have different things arrive on farm, and this is why my comment at the start is it's got to be ongoing, hasn't it? But you're right. I think it often is difficult for people to think about coming to an end of vaccination. You know, it's much easier to start. It's very difficult to stop. There are some things that you would probably never stop. Personally, things like BVD, probably lungworm as well, I'd put in there. You know, but other things, perhaps IBR would be an example where you might work towards an end goal of not having to do it. Sorry if that tries to answer the question.
Thanks, James.
Oh, good. So we're just coming to the end. Insurance against disease, that the toxic mastitis comes in here again, where some herds, very high yielding type herds, you know, the sort of 11, 12,000 litre type herds, low cell count, you know, where the odd sporadic, very sick cow with clinical mastitis, I know some herds that will do it almost as an insurance against that. But you know, that's not generally the norm, I guess. So we go blackleg, that's a calf with tetanus, seen actually a few months ago. But there we go. I'd just like to end this section again acknowledging Andrew, because this is the way he used to think about it, and I think this is a really good way of thinking about vaccine use. It's almost like this, if you like, where towards the left you've got you've got the importance of environment management. So the further left you go, the more important the environment management becomes. Whereas the further right you go, the more important the vaccination becomes. And obviously there are ones that sit somewhere in the middle, you know, the ringworms, the salmonellas, the lungworms, where, you know, the vaccination is not the be all and end all, but for some herds it might be a lot more important, you know, and it becomes something to think about. But for people on the call, I've always found it quite useful to think of vaccination like this in terms of what you're trying to achieve versus, you know, what the vaccine can do for you against the environment management. Okay, finally then, I guess, and Richard was very much coming from this point, there's so many available, and I thought actually it would be quite interesting to just list them. So there are 38 on the market that I counted certainly and found towards the back end of last year. So there are, you know, the two main BVD ones. There's a few IBR ones, and the marker vaccines now are becoming, you know, widely used. There's a couple of lepto ones, obviously. There's several that you'd lump in with sort of diarrhea stroke scour type things, and salmonella would sit in there, I guess. There's a whole heap of calf pneumonia vaccines aimed at but predominantly viral ones, but there's also the Pasteurella vaccines, which, you know, certainly sort of more beef finishing units might find particularly useful and particularly important. There's other ones as well. A couple of the mastitis ones have touched on that. The Clostridial vaccines, you know, very, very multivalent, tending to do lots of things in one, although there is still the old blackleg one as well. And then there's sort of also rounds. Your Huskvat will come in there for lungworm, ringworm, Coxiella, would you believe it? Rabies, would you believe it? You can vaccinate against. So, you know, there are those. There was also the blue tongue vaccine. And of course, we're always got one eye on with climate change and things, you know, other things coming available. And there's much interest in this and ongoing research in, you know, what might need to happen if something new suddenly appeared. You know, what would the strategy be? But that's beyond what we can cover today. Okay. If there's no other comments, Jamie, at this stage, I was going to sort of move on to maybe some of the things that Richard and I discussed about the barriers to using vaccines, if that was okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, James.
Yeah.
We have had a couple of questions, but I think I'm going to hold them until the end of this section because I think they're probably going to be more relevant later on. But I would just remind everybody, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so confidentially, so no one will know who's asking, and there is no such thing as a silly question. I can guarantee if you're thinking of a question, someone else will also want to know the answer as well. So do type your questions in. Thanks, James.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, thank you. So the barriers to using vaccines, and Richard and I touched on this a little bit, and it'll come up later, but I guess you could list considerations like this, you know, various management things. Clearly, cost benefit is going to be very important. You know, what are we likely to get back for all that spend on a vaccine product? What products are available? You know, there might be some things that come and go in terms of availability. Certainly the price might be different, but we also need to think about efficacy. You know, what's the vaccine going to do? What do we want it to do? What are we trying to achieve with it? And have we perhaps thought about those 4 categories I ran through in terms of how much are we hanging on the vaccine in all that? There are other things, probably beyond this, but food safety, health and safety. I mean, classically, for those of you sheep farmers on the call, of course, you've got to be very careful using some things. Scabivax is a great example. You don't want to scratch yourself with that, for obvious reasons. So there are some things you might think about on that side. I'd really like to also just remind everyone on the call about sort of individual cows and herds, in that when you vaccinate a population, and of course we're going through it with coronavirus at the moment, there'll always be some animals within the population that perhaps don't mount a sufficient immune response. They might be under the weather, so to speak, on the day, immunocompromised, sick. I mean, we shouldn't vaccinate, sick animals. So if they're under treatment for something, I wouldn't vaccinate them, because you're not likely to get a particularly good response. But even cows that look okay, there may be varying degrees of immune response within the population. You'll get some cows that mount a very robust immune response, some cows that might not, intercurrent Johne's disease, whatever it is, might mean that they don't respond as we'd like. So you're always going to have that within the population. You're going to have a natural variation in response anyway. Even amongst a healthy population, you're going to, biologically speaking, have quite a variation in response, even amongst healthy animals in the population. And finally, don't forget the size of the challenge. The vaccination will move us to a certain point, but I don't want to keep using BVD, because BVD is often done to death, but it is a good example, because you would not just vaccinate your herd. Richard's already said this. If you had animals within the herd that were persistently infected with BVD virus, they would shed enormous amounts of virus into that population. If you think of a like a seesaw, you'd have the challenge on one side and the immune response on the other. If the challenge was overwhelming, it doesn't matter if the population's vaccinated, you could still have problems. So just because you're vaccinating, it doesn't mean you're also not trying to reduce the challenge, getting rid of persistently infected animals with BVD, for example. So there are those things we do need to consider when we are looking to vaccinate. There's also very practical things, in terms of barriers to doing it. And I know, because I've tried to read the small print on these things, and it's not easy. The ability to follow guidelines and data sheet, and you will know, I know what goes on. There's various sort of, oh yeah, don't worry about what the data sheet said, just vaccinate everything every 3 months, or vaccinate the whole lot here, whatever. The data sheet is important. It is important to follow the guidelines. You do need to do what it says on the tin. I'll give you an example. That I don't want to keep going back to mastitis either, but the Start vaccination product loudly proclaims that you vaccinate around drying off, 45 days-ish before calving, 10 days before calving. So you then vaccinate them again just before calving, and then you vaccinate for a third time around day 40, day 50 in milk. So perhaps people have tended to use that and ignored the data sheet and just vaccinated all cows roughly every 3 months. That's not what the data sheet says, and there is good reason to follow the data sheet. So the ability to follow guidelines, talk it through with your vet, make sure we're doing what it says, and that extends to where you stick the vaccine, under the skin, in the muscle, in the neck, whatever it is. These things are important. And the efficacy is linked to how you actually administer the vaccine. There are other barriers, and it is difficult. It's very time consuming to do this. The cost of the labor, the time, the handling facilities. I absolutely appreciate that, we perhaps say, oh yeah, you should vaccinate, but there's a lot of moving parts to actually doing it. Boosters, we need to remember, and Richard's brought this, when we're going to booster, how often we need to do it, what with. perhaps overestimating, one of the barriers might be that we just completely overestimate what we're going to get out of it. So going in with our eyes wide open, in terms of what we're expecting to happen, what we expect to gain. Storage is a huge thing, and I want to come on to that in a minute. And also mindset. Do we believe the vaccine's going to work? Are we generally sort of quite skeptical of these sorts of things in terms of efficacy and our own experiences with it? What we tend to focus on in terms of controlling certain things. It's interesting to use the lungworm vaccine in this. It's not a new thing, but generally over the years, people have tended not to vaccinate against lungworm. So perhaps the mindset's changed, in terms of why bother to do that. Just a word on storage. This is data from a trial. This was looking at fridges. So these were 27 farms with fridges on farm. These fridges on these farms were followed for a year. And you had data loggers put into the fridges. So little things that quietly monitor temperature every 30 minutes. And there was one at the top of the fridge and one at the bottom of the fridge. This just shows, on average in a whole year, none of the fridges could actually maintain the temperature between 2 and 8 degrees. So there's the dotted lines there at 2 degrees and 8 degrees. So that's what you'd recommend generally with a fridge. And you had all sorts of temperatures from boiling hot, the red dots, to absolutely freezing cold, below freezing, the blue dots, in all months of the year on all farms. Massive variation. When you looked at individual fridge, so this is a good example of a trace from a fridge on one of these farms where, generally speaking, it wasn't too bad actually. It was most of the time could stay between 2 and 8, barring a few exceptions. And also the top of the fridge and the bottom of the fridge. So the top of the fridge is in green, the bottom of the fridge is in blue. Notice how the lines move together. So that suggests there's very little variation in the fridge temperature between the top and bottom. There's not much fluctuation. Compare that fridge with this fridge, and the lines are all over the place. I mean, they're massively divergent, which would suggest there's a clear issue between, with the temperature gradient within the fridge itself. So some areas of the fridge are boiling hot and some areas of the fridge are freezing cold, to put it simply. Now, whether that's a power issue, whether that's because the fridge is overstocked, whether that's because people keep opening the door all the time, or storing whatever with a can of Diet Coke in there or something, or the old Snickers Duo, whatever it is. But there's huge variation. Now, clearly, if we're relying on these fridges on farm to store a vaccine product, now, some of these vaccines are live. If you've got a live vaccine, so take the Bavella one, for example, the BVD one, live vaccines tend to be quite sensitive to higher temperatures. So you really don't want to go above the recommended range. If you're thinking about inactivated vaccines, where it's a killed version, if you like, the inactivated vaccines rely on something called an adjuvant, so there's something in there to carry the vaccine. These are generally aluminium, for example, but they're very, very sensitive to cold. So for example, if it's below freezing, you can damage the adjuvant and damage the vaccine, and that's not reversible. By bringing the vaccine back up to somewhere between 2 and 8, you can't reverse that change. It's really, really important to store the vaccine recommended range, generally between 2 and 8 on most of these labels. So you get your batch of lungworm vaccine, it's delivered, the cold chain, it's delivered to you, kept at 2 to 8, and then you bung it in a fridge, that's running at 12 degrees or something. Well then, all that investment is potentially lost. Another couple of things just on oh, sorry, Jamie, go on. Yeah.
Do move on. There is a couple of questions on that, and actually I'm quite keen to bring Richard in because I know he gets vaccines delivered to the farm. So it works really well at Maenhir, as I understand. But a couple of questions. So you've talked about the storage and the fridge being, the ideal between 2 and 8. How long can a vaccine sort of actually survive outside of that. So I'm thinking about when farmers might be actually administering something and it's a steaming hot day. You know, how long could that be? You know, on the side of the race for those practical things. And I know we all see it. Farmers calling at the vets, and they pick up the medicines and they go onto the dashboard on a hot day in the vehicle, which is probably well above the recommended 8 degrees, isn't it? So how careful do we have to be?
Okay, so it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of putting a number on it. But for example, if it was a particularly hot day, you would certainly not want to have the vaccines lying around while we were vaccinating cows on the parlour or something like that. I would prefer to have them in a cool box, you know, so you had one bottle on the go and the rest of it was kept in a cool box with some ice bricks. You know, that would be sensible. You're trying to maintain the cold chain, aren't you? So until the point of use, most of it's still, you know, kept cool, and the bottle in your hand is what you're using. I wouldn't have them all out there on the side, you know, by the race in the baking heat. No. And likewise, transporting in the car. If we're going a short distance, you know, we haven't got the heater full blast on in the car and it's not a hot day, well, then a short distance, we're just trying to get it to the fridge as quickly as possible. If the distance is long or it's a particularly hot day, and like you say, Jamie, not on the dashboard, it would make great sense to have a cool box with you, or a cool bag, you know, a supermarket cool bag, couple of ice bricks in the cool bag, and take it back with you in that route, like you'd carry your ice creams home from the shopping, you know, so they're not a puddle on the floor when you get back. So I think trying to maintain the cold chain is very important. What do you think, Richard?
Yeah, I agree totally. We first of all, we get our vaccines delivered through a buying group, having had a prescription from our vets then, and they come packaged up really cool and very professionally. You know, we get texts then about when they're coming to be able to transfer them into the fridge, but quite often when they're unpacked, they're you know, the ice is or it's still very cool. It isn't completely iced then, but it's at the right temperature. But we, since Jen and I have been doing the accounts here, then when we the vaccines, then they go in a cool box then, because having paid for the damn things, we need to keep them at the right temperature. So yeah, there's a cool box beside when we're vaccinating beside the race, and yeah, Jennifer is very, very keen on that sort of stuff.
Good.
Thanks.
I hope that answers the question, Jamie. Yeah, I think that's really important to make.
Yeah, we've had another question as well. I think they're talking about agitating, but do you shake vaccines? They're talking about agitating to mix.
Okay, depends what it says on the label. Some will be in a suspension, and yes, they will need to be gently shaken before use, you know, like a bottle of white penicillin. Some won't need shaking. So it'll be on a very product by product basis, but it'll say on the label if you need to do it. I can dig out some examples if that, you know, if that helps. You know, as part of the call, I can give some examples of ones that need to be agitated, shaken before use, and we can pop that on a message to everyone.
The Huskback is what, yeah, Huskback is what they're really getting at, which is
great example. Yeah, great example, Richard. Thank you for reminding me. Huskback, you absolutely do need to shake it before use because it's a suspension of killed larvae. Yes.
Thanks, James. We'll let you carry on a bit further with the presentation.
No, good. You know, well done, Richard, on the Huskback thing. That's a very good example. Yeah, so really just to get to the end of this second chunk then. So there was a little bit published. This is a nice paper. Came out of Nottingham a few years ago, Liz Cresswell, when they just surveyed a group of farmers on the use of cattle vaccines specifically. So I thought this was of interest, perhaps within the context of what we're talking about. So, you know, the vast majority of farmers surveyed vaccinated their cattle against something. What's interesting, we talk about the route of administration. So around a quarter of farmers surveyed weren't using the correct route of administration. 3/4 of them were, you know, so if it said, look, under the skin, please, you know, they were putting it in the muscle. you know, and I know it might sound very trivial, but it really is important with the vaccines. If it says under the skin, it needs to go under the skin, you know, because that's how these are absorbed and work. If you put it in the muscle, you can affect the efficacy of the vaccine product. Recommended injection site, and I know this also is difficult, isn't it? Because particularly vaccinating in the neck muscle versus vaccinating in, you know, in the rump, for example, you know, particularly, I mean, you'll know in West Wales, you know, we have the same problem in Somerset. Nobody likes injecting in the neck in case you get the odd injection site reaction that interferes with a TB test. But again, these things, the studies are done, generally speaking, the neck muscle is a greater mass of muscle, you know, particularly if you think about dairy cows, and actually you think you might be injecting into the rump, but in cows, particularly body condition score less than 2, you know, you probably haven't hit enough muscle mass, you know, and by injecting in the neck, you're definitely getting it into the muscle, and that's important for that particular vaccine. This is important as well. I think, you know, a lot of the farmers surveyed admitted that, you know, they weren't administering the second dose. So if it was a primary course, you know, classic sort of primary course, 2 doses 3 to 4 weeks apart, they weren't administering that second dose within the recommended time frame, you know, and clearly then that's going to affect, you know, the establishment of the immune response and effectively waste the first dose. And some farmers were vaccinating much earlier than what was recommended. You know, far fewer doing that. And generally speaking, you know, that's perhaps quite difficult to do sometimes. But again, these things are important, and we know, you know, some farms, some herds do trip up on this and find this difficult to implement. Various things, motivation to vaccinate. You know, so on the dairy side, a number of reasons, as you'd expect. You know, losses, you know, veterinary advice, control disease. I always think it's interesting, maybe that comes back to the question from one of the people on the call earlier. Always done it, don't even think about it, you know, and actually for some things that's probably important, like the BVD vaccine or lungworm or whatever. If you've had your fingers burnt in the past, you know, you do it, and that's that. Specifically for dairy, you know, what were dairy farmers that were surveyed, so there's over 100 of them that were specifically dairy farmers, what were they vaccinating against? The vast majority, it was BVD, although not all. 2/3 lepto, you know, so classically, I guess these would be herds with some sort of grazing component. If you were completely shut, no access to grazing at all, you know, dry cows don't go out, for example, well then vaccinating the adult herd for lepto. If you were a closed herd, no natural service, you know, you managed your heifers perhaps with a booster, you had no evidence of active infection with lepto, and you monitored the bulk tank, we'll come on to monitoring in a minute, then perhaps you wouldn't vaccinate for lepto, but the vast majority of herds probably would need to or ought to. 2/3 were. Getting on for 2/3 doing IBR, you know, so perhaps evidence of active infection, endemically infected herds. Less than 1/3 doing lungworm, which I always think is quite interesting. About 1/4 vaccinated for Clostridium diseases, you know, despite that sort of insurance type policy we talked about with the odd blackleg event or, you know, the odd tetanus or something, particularly in young stock. And less than 20% using calf respiratory vaccines or calf scour vaccines. But again, perhaps that reflects, you know, people's sort of focus on other areas with those, or the sort of lack of belief in efficacy, perhaps. So that's that sort of second section. And then moving into the last section, we were going to sort of talk much more with Richard about what happens at Maenhir at the moment. So just to bring Richard back in, if that's all right, Richard, would you like to walk people through what you do specifically? So I've got heifers and cows here. What about the heifers to start with?
Yeah, the heifers, as I said earlier, we try and get our heifers born from June to Christmas. So at the start of bulling, you know, we will start serving the biggest bunch of heifers around about middle of August, towards the end of August. Back in at the end of June and July, we will use the whole all R1s as such, then the bulling heifers, we will start on the BVD, IBR, and lepto. Yeah, some of them might be young and won't be served then until Christmas almost then, but just for ease of management and simplicity, find it so much easier, right, with vaccinating and do the bunch. Then they might be in 2 or 3 different bunches, yes, but you know where you are, you know, keeping tag numbers and writing it down and all that sort of thing is needs to be done. But it's so much practically, you know what you've done as a bunch. Then that's how we find it so much easier to do it, and check in then that you know, the ages and things are right to be able to use those vaccines, which they are for those then.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, they are. Yeah.
Onto the cows. We are using Bovella as a booster, IBR every 6 months as inactivated, then dead IBR. Then try and get that as a routine. Then July and again at Christmas, because it's so easy just to forget. And when did you do it last? I said July and Christmas. It's July and January.
July and January. Yeah, so you're spacing them.
The lepto booster. Then prior to turnout, then is what we're doing.
Good.
When on the IBR, I'll just cover off the marker live to start with, and then the inactivated. Then so the 2 doses of the IBR. Then just 1 dose of the lepto. Two doses of lepto. 1. Okay.
Yeah, and certainly, so we went through it, didn't it? Because I know you had some questions. You know, you talked about age at the first vaccination, and we've checked that off. I'll just come up presentation view because I've got my notes here. You know, because Bovella you can use from 3 months, IBR from 3 months. If you're injecting lepto, that leptovoid one, you can go from 1 month, actually 2 doses 4 weeks apart. So just to sort of reassure people, we went through that, and I'm sure you would have talked about with your vet anyway. The live versus dead. I mean, the live vaccines. I suppose my comment about the Bovella in the cows, if you read the data sheet, because Bovella is a live vaccine, and it's 2 strains, you know, but it does say on the data sheet that you shouldn't use it in pregnant cows, or there is a sort of a theoretical risk if the cow is pregnant that you could pass virus across the placenta into the calf. So the data sheet does say, I think it says something like on a case-by-case basis that you don't, it's not recommended to inject pregnant cows. But of course, on an all-year-round calving system, you want to do the Bovella booster as a batch, you know, for ease. But I mean, I suppose all I would say about that is it's a theoretical risk, and I guess then that comes back to your monitoring, doesn't it? Because you're monitoring for persistently infected, that you would find that if a calf ever was born, you tissue test and find that it was apparently a persistently infected calf. And then of course, you know, then there might be some discussion about when that cow was boosted with Bovella. You know, was she boosted at a time when she was sort of in early pregnancy, if you like? But otherwise, I mean, what you're doing sounds very sensible.
Yeah, a couple of the points there that you've put up there, several vaccines at once. Generally, it's only the heifers. They'll have the 3 vaccines all in one go. And apart from the BVD, because they'll have that first time and it's only a 1 dose. Question that I've had, and I've asked James, and we work all this in conjunction with a herd health plan with our vets then, is the BVD. Having used Bovella, could we then use another BVD vaccine as a booster then? Because, you know, Bovella is normally twice the price. Are we able to use, say, a cheaper version, still covering them off with vaccinating for the BVD then? We've talked about that, James, haven't we?
We have, yeah, and I mean, so I guess the advantages of the Bovella is it's 2 strains, whereas the other BVD vaccine, I think I'm right in saying, is not only inactivated, but it's 1 strain. I mean, you certainly could do. I'd want to go and check that before I put anything in writing. But if you're getting immunity up with an initial Bovella and then you're switching to an inactivated and you're following the data sheet on the inactivated, you certainly could. I don't know whether herds do, and BVD is not my specialist subject area. Because you're using the Bovella, personally, I would stick with the Bovella and I would keep boostering with the Bovella. You know, personally, because you've got the coverage with the strains.
Yeah, the upshot is that we're going to go back in with Bovella for everything then, and not explore a cheaper version then.
I think of more interest is the several vaccines at once thing, because you do. I mean, it's very common, isn't it? You know, to save labour and cost and time, that you're doing multiple vaccines at once, and then you really are hoping that these cows are healthy enough, positive energy balance, you know, and of course in early lactation when they're giving a lot of milk, there will be an element of negative energy balance, you know, that will affect immune response. You're asking them to mount several immune responses at the same time against several things. Now, whilst some of these are licensed, you know, and you read some of it and they are licensed to be given with something else, once you start using multiple things, then you will inevitably reduce the chance of you know, a good immune response against all of them. So it's just worth, you know, perhaps in heifers maybe less, you know, but if we're doing lots of boosters to cows all at the same time, and if those boosters particularly are in early lactation, then that might affect, you know, the chance of a decent immune response.
Yeah, we have split out in the milking cows, then we have split out those vaccinations then, but the heifers would be all together.
Yeah, good. Okay, but I mean, certainly on the face of it, yeah, sorry, Jamie, go on. Yeah.
I am going back a little bit now in the conversation, but you were talking about transfer of either immunity or a problem over to a calf. We've had a question come in which is asking specifically about, thinking specifically about an embryo transfer process. If you're vaccinating for IBR, BVD, etc., what are the chances that when you're testing, you get a positive result?
So testing the animal that's been vaccinated?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So actually the ET one's interesting, isn't it? So, but I'm not aware there's any evidence that you would. So the ET one, for example, using a live vaccine like Bovella, again, I'm going to have to refer to manufacturers here, but I'm not aware there's any evidence you can infect the embryo, if you like, the sort of the ball of cells. But I suppose it's theoretically possible in terms of actually having positive results on screening programs. If animals are transiently viremic, so they've had a live vaccine, they could be transiently viremic, and it could look like, carrying on the BVD theme, you could have a PI. But then, of course, always if you've, for example, screened and think you might have a persistently infected animal, you would always recheck, you know, that you would confirm that a few weeks later. You know, so if you had an apparent positive persistently infected animal, you would then subsequently confirm that with a follow-up test. And for those animals that are transiently viremic because they've had a live vaccine, you know, then obviously when you subsequently retested them, they would be negative because they weren't persistently infected. So these are getting quite technical questions now. If you can write them down, Jamie, I'm keen to answer them properly. Yep. And for example, some of these might actually need a little bit of thought. Okay. So yeah, I do want to answer them, do want to note them. So we've had something about embryo transfer, okay, and something about live vaccines and positive test results. Yeah.
Perfect. We'll make the promise to the person that asked that question that we will come back with an answer after the webinar. Then in that case, we've got your email address. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Good. Okay. Just to move on, Maenhir then. Sorry, because I'm conscious of time. So then, what Richard and I sort of wanted to move on to, if that's what's being done, what's the monitoring? You know, sort of where are we in terms of free, infection established, control, what are we doing? And so just again, for people on the call, I suppose to step back and think about what could we use to monitor infection status. Everyone knows about bulk milk, and that still is the most common probably. Of course, you could use pooled blood samples in young stock. You could use pooled fecal samples, examples there. A pooled fecal sample is quite a nice one for monitoring gutworm challenge. For example, a pooled blood sample you could do for PI hunts and for BVD. At an individual level, of course, again, using milk, screening milk for antibody and antigen, but Johne's disease comes in here, obviously. So you're screening for antibody to the infection that may result in Johne's disease. Blood, any cow that aborts, it's a sensible decision to take a blood from her to see if she's antibody negative for Neospora, because then the abortion event is unlikely to have anything to do with Neospora. If she's antibody positive for Neospora, you can't say she definitely aborted due to Neospora, but she's been exposed in the past. Or you could be talking about bleeding, a handful of yearling heifers or something for antibody to things like BVD or IBR to see if you've had any evidence for exposure. So blood sampling yearlings, before they then undergo a vaccine program, you would expect them to be antibody negative for BVD and IBR. They haven't seen it, and then you're going to vaccinate them. Tissue testing, so everyone knows about tag and testing, for the BVD virus, that's been a real game changer. And fecal testing, so, if you've got a J5, so-called red cow, antibody positive several times for Johne's, you could do something like a fecal PCR to try and confirm, if you like, that the animal's like to be infected. There's also a blood and a milk test, what's called phage testing, with the Actiphage system. So there's various things you can do. Richard also has to keep uppermost, maybe not uppermost, Richard, you've got a lot of things on your mind, but somewhere in the back of your mind, we've got to think about what we need to do to keep any aligned contracts happy on sort of higher welfare schemes. So for Richard, he has to do various things, don't you, Richard? So for BVD status, you've got to do these on your scheme.
Yeah, we're on Tesco cheese contract then.
Yeah, so you've got to do
the BVD and the bulk PCR, and well, two of those things, like the already BVD is the young stock screen, bulk milk PCR, or the tissue testing the calves.
That's right. So those may be applicable to some herds or combinations of them. The bulk milk PCR is particularly recommended, and is often a sort of a mainstay of these higher welfare schemes. Johne's disease infection. So under the TSDG rules, you have to screen every 3 months for milk antibody in individual cows. Under TSDG, you have to do bulk milk antibody every quarter for IBR virus, and of course, because you're vaccinating, that has to be more about that in a minute. That has to be a particular test. And under TSDG, you either have to vaccinate for lepto, or if you're not vaccinating, you must test the bulk milk for antibody every 3 months. So of course, because you're vaccinating, that takes care of that. So just on that, because it is a minefield, if you're vaccinating, not vaccinating, testing for antibody, how do you tell the difference between an animal that's actually infected and is therefore making antibody, or an animal that's actually vaccinated, the so-called DIVA, differentiating infected from vaccinated animals. And this is important, and again, another thing that people have to get their heads around sometimes is telling the difference. If cows are antibody positive, is that because they are definitely infected? Is that because they've been exposed, mounted an immune response, and are now okay? Or is it because they've been vaccinated? So the three examples on the right-hand side are really nice ones for that. So if an adult cow that is not pregnant, happens to see BVD virus, she'll make antibodies to it. She'll what's called seroconvert, So she'll be exposed, make antibodies, and be fine. IBR is different. So if that naive cow meets IBR virus, she'll make antibodies, yes, but she'll also become infected for life. So she's not only exposed, but she's also now infected. It's a bit like the cold sore virus, these herpes virus things. She'll shed IBR virus forevermore. If you're thinking about yonis now, if they're antibody positive, yes, they're more likely to be infected. Of course, they're more likely to be shedding as well. And of course, IBR virus is one of those things, if you are vaccinating, you can tell the difference between cows that have been vaccinated for IBR and cows that are actually naturally and infected for life with IBR. So different diseases will have different interpretations, if you like, depending on what we're trying to measure. So then Richard did some sampling and sort of shared some test results with me, Richard. This was going back to October.
Yeah.
Here's your IBR bulk milk, so GE. So of course this is looking for evidence of infected cows, because the vaccine is a modified, it takes the GE thing out. So you would still have a certain proportion of the herd that are naturally infected with the IBR virus.
Yeah.
So with time, of course, you hope that these are phased out, naturally as they exit the herd, and that coming along behind them are lots of lactation ones which have never seen IBR, are protected by, sort of vaccine, and before you vaccinate them as heifers, as yearling heifers, they are antibody negative. They've never seen it.
So this is going back almost then to a reason why we need just to keep on vaccinating. Whilst that is their positive, we just need to keep on vaccinating, isn't it?
So I guess that this comes back to risk and the sort of the biosecurity, doesn't it? So classically, IBR would spread aerosol. So if, for example, you had your dry cows right next door to the baby calves, and in the same airspace, well, then there's potential transmission, from an infected cow or cows shedding IBR virus, because they'll really, particularly at calving, periods of stress, they'll shed, yourself, if people suffer from cold sores, when you're down, that's when they appear. But of course, your calves are away from the adult cows, aren't they, at the separate unit up the lane?
Yeah, a long way, yeah.
So you've got no young stock in shared air spaces with adult cows, I don't think, have you?
No.
So, I mean, then you're into when young stock are out, nose to nose contact, field boundaries, paddocks, that sort of thing. But it's the sort of thing you could screen, young stock, will come on to that in a minute, prior to them having their course of the IBR vaccine at a year old, and really they should be antibody negative. They've never seen it. Lepto, of course, if you do a bulk milk for lepto in a vaccinated herd, it's almost meaningless, because you can't tell the difference between vaccine antibodies and not vaccine antibodies, although people do talk about, of course, the vaccine antibody will wane with time. So that's why you sort of booster in the spring before they go out, so you sort of get that immune booster right up. But sort of towards the end of the season, so you did this in October, you're only a medium positive, not a high positive, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that was October. So Richard shared sort of the last 3 months worth of monitoring with me. So we just thought it'd be interesting for people on the call to sort of think about what they do and what it might mean. So we're doing a bit of bulk milk. Just to share your yonis, so it's always interesting to sort of get this in, even though we can't vaccinate against it. It's another thing we're screening for as an infectious disease. So here you are doing your individual antibody screen. So you appear to be very low prevalence here, Richard. This is looking good. So percentage scoring in that J5 category.
Yeah. Yeah, we have been affected probably 5 to 10 years back with the Onis. We had a particular problem, but we've actually been testing now, coming up for 8 years. Then screening, then whole screening for about 8 years, and snatching calves and all that sort of all the sort of stuff that goes with it, and not trying not to breed cows back that have turned red then, or J3 or J4 then, trying not to breed them back. It doesn't always work, because something comes up and catches you from behind, a young heifer that you know, you didn't think where has she got that from, but you know, is it transferred through colostrum or whatever? You know, when she's in calf to a black and white for the second time, but she'd come up red, it's very, very difficult, but we would snatch those calves anyway.
Yeah, good. I mean, you talk about the heifers, you know, that column right on the end there, a lot of the milk recording organisations now and the national Yonis management plan, you'll hear people talking about perhaps monitoring percentage of first lactation animals that become antibody positive, and you can see, you know, there's none there essentially, you know, and that's held up as perhaps a sort of a more recent marker of control, you know, and certainly they shouldn't be going antibody positive in lactation 1. You know, whether that definitely means they're not infected, of course, is another thing altogether. But you know, looking online, you've clearly got a system in place, and you've got some nice outcome measures about keeping the prevalence of antibody positive, you know, as low as possible. Good.
But if you go back to that May test there, where there's percentage in that first lactation, from memory, that was a heifer that's still in the first lactation, but we'd struggled to get her in calf, It might have even been a couple. And just as she's sort of thinking, well, what am I going to do with this cow? She turns up, she starts coming J3, J4, and then you start looking back. So, you know, they would be stretched out lactation. They'd be calved a lot of days, struggled to get them in calf, wondering why, but at the end it tells you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, quite interesting there. Yeah, the impact that something like that will have. Yeah. And then you kindly did a bit more monitoring then before Christmas. So just some information for people. So you talked about your BVD status earlier on and how long you've been, you know, sort of working on that. And here you are with a bulk milk sample in December, and we're looking on the extreme right here of BVD virus, so what's called a PCR on bulk milk. So that's looking for actual virus. So if you had a persistently infected adult milking animal on the day of the test. So it's important people remember, you know, obviously the dry cows, you could have a PI dry cow, she won't get into the tank. Anything that's under treatment, you know, and the milk's being dumped for whatever reason, that won't get into the tank. Anything in the hospital group, whatever it is. But on the day, everything that was in milk on that day, there's no evidence of a PI in the adult milking herd. And generally speaking, it would be good practice to do that twice a year. You know, so you sort of keep on top of that, as it were. So no evidence of that, and presumably then, Richard, BVD free under Goretti, you've been doing that for a while now.
Yes, yeah. We're only silver status because we probably joined the party on that a bit late, because we were always struggling to find heifers that hadn't been vaccinated. You know, to TB test. Well, we were pretty much in June, July, and we'd already vaccinated them, given them 1 dose of BVD. So we were always struggling to get a bunch, but we are making a point now of testing and screening then before we get those heifers vaccinated. So just to make a point then, a routine vet in the spring before we turn them out, that we'll screen just to make sure that we catch up with those, because you know, that looks gold, but we've only just come out of bronze and got ourselves into silver, but you know, in effect we are gold.
Yes, and a good point, isn't it? You know, to sort of, you know, get half a dozen or so blood sampled before they're vaccinated and have a little sentinel group. Just on this, so interestingly, then you had a couple of young stock that bleed. So 63, 64, she's antibody positive for IBR. Interesting. So we were talking about exposure for things like IBR, and antibody positive for BVD, it looks like. So I just flip on to people, so you get these interpretation of the results. You know, so we appear to, so that animal appears to be antibody positive for both then.
Yeah.
I just wondered
what's the reason for that?
Yeah, so where that might have come from. So because we talked about shared air spaces, because they don't receive any other vaccine, do they? So there was a person on the call asking about if you vaccinate for something, can you get a positive test result? Do they receive anything else as calves?
We do vaccinate then the Risperdal 4 in
Okay.
dairy heifers, but this was a beef heifer, beef calf.
Right.
I don't think, I'm fairly sure that it wasn't vaccinated, but it would have been in the same shed as those that had been vaccinated. So maybe that might be the reason.
No, not in the same shed. So if so that's interesting. You say so with sort of the Risperdal product, and again, I stand to be corrected perhaps by sort of people who know more about the vaccine technology than I, but the IBR component to it's not a marker, I don't think. So if you're vaccinating with Risperdal at relatively young ages, you could have persistence of antibody, and that could catch you out on a young stock screen. Similarly for BVD. But if this was a beef animal that hasn't had any vaccines as a younger calf, so just because it was housed with animals that had been vaccinated, then that's that's not going to happen. So it must have come into contact with something that was actively shedding, if you like.
Yeah.
So something is shedding IBR virus, or it was vaccinated. Yeah, of course it could well have been vaccinated, couldn't it? Yeah,
it could have been vaccinated as well, couldn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because we really struggled with that group.
Sorry,
we really struggled to get a group of calves. Really struggled to get a group of calves together that hadn't been vaccinated, and we sort of said, right, okay, we'll do these beef calves, which they were, because no, they hadn't been vaccinated. They're going to be sold at 3 months, 4 months old, 5 months old, somewhere around there, which they were getting close to. But we don't know. To my knowledge, they weren't vaccinated then, and I've taken part in, we asked to be doing the vaccinating, but they're in a pen, jumbled all together, and mark them as we do them, and could have been vaccinated, couldn't it?
Could have been. So I guess it puts more emphasis on the screening now coming up this year, doesn't it? Before the heifers go to and things like that, we just need to maybe check the screening. Good. Okay. So some final thoughts, I suppose. I'm conscious of time, and there was one more thing you and I just wanted to touch on. The current vaccination strategies we've talked about, these appear to be sound. You've got some monitoring in place. I just wanted to pick your brains, if I may, because when we met last summer, you talked about lungworm, and I know it was on your mind that you do.
Yeah, we're talking about lungworm. Yeah, using lungworm. Heifers, we've stopped using Huskvac or Dictol as it was in those days then, years and years ago, and we sort of struggled with porons and that sort of porons in young heifers and that sort of thing. But increasingly we're having to use the Eprinex type products then for milking cows, sometimes twice in a year.
Right.
If we could stop doing that, there's a lot of advantages in terms of production, but also for the environment. And if we could stop, or even if we could half the amount of porons for our heifers and stop the Eprinex, then for the environment and all that sort of thing, cost effectiveness. And if we could monitor it, is Huskvac a tool that would help us?
Oh, so yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's no doubt that over the years it's been well described, by various people about the waning immunity generally in the sort of the dairy herd population to lungworm, because there's been a real shift away from vaccine use towards what are, let's be honest, very, very easy to use poron products that are quite persistent in terms of action. So it's I hesitate to use the word phrase, but it's almost fire and forget, isn't it? you can use these porons in first and second season, and these young heifers do not get the opportunity to see lungworm in inverted commas and mount an effective immune response. And then you factor in, we can have very dry summers, so in terms of the challenge, in some seasons can be actually quite small anyway. And so, of course, these heifers then enter the adult herd with very poor immunity to lungworm, and herds like yourself where there's a significant grazing component. It's interesting, and you're not the only person. People will tend to describe, come the autumn, come late in the season, we hear coughing in the adult population. And there's what's described as reinfection syndrome in the adults. That these are animals that have been infected in the past, and they become reinfected and symptoms appear. But it comes right back, you almost go right back to the first season heifers. And I would really bang the drum for lungworm vaccination in first season and really hold back on the poron. And a lot of herds would now, Gerald Coles famously at Bristol, 25 years ago, he worked with a group of dairy farms in North Somerset, and he sent them containers and packages and said, look, do what you want to do, whatever you're going to do with first season, do it anyway, but before you treat them, worm them, porons, anything, just get me some dung samples out of these groups of heifers and send them to me. And of course he could demonstrate that people were worming when there was no need, that gutworm populations were very low, and there was no need to worm these animals, these groups, and in fact all you were doing then was reducing the chance that these animals would ever see lungworm, and mount some sort of immune response. So I would say first season, because you've described actual symptoms in the adult herd, you've described seeing the disease, the response to treatment using the epinomectin type products, and all the other things you said. I'm glad you brought up the environment thing. I can see it coming. There's much more attention paid to worming products. That I would go lungworm vaccination in first season. Don't treat them with porons or anything. Lungworm vaccination, turnout, and then some pooled fecal sample monitoring mid-season. Get to mid-July, pick up some dung from these heifer groups out in the paddock. If the worm egg count's above 100, for example, well, we might need treatment for gutworm. But if it's below 100, let them go on.
Yeah,
happy with the
challenge for us.
Sorry, Richard, go on.
Yeah, new challenge for us this year is going to be try and husk back all these heifers, get them out. I suppose the tool that we have is the fecal egg counts to go with that. But whilst we're trying to carve these heifers at 20-23 months, expecting them to give 30 litres as well, it's been very, very easy to use these porons, keep everything at bay, but they are very, very naive. But if they can come into the herd just that little bit more armed, I presume is what you would call it,
Yep.
And looking to save a bit of cost and helping the environment save the cost and benefiting the heifers as well.
But that's it. You're trying to get to a stage a few years down the track where you have an adult population that you don't see symptoms in late season and have to get the epinomectins out again. I mean, that's what you're trying to achieve, isn't it? You're trying to get to that stage where you're vaccinating for lungworm in first season. You're then, hopefully, these heifers are going to see some lungworm in first season and see it again in second season, but of course be able to mount a response and reinforce it, and then they're good to go. That's what we're trying to achieve. The only thing, of course, is talking about the barriers earlier on. It's hard work, isn't it? The lungworm, the husk back is what, 2 doses 4 weeks apart, and then 2 weeks before you turn them out.
Yeah,
something like that, isn't it? So it requires quite a bit of forward planning to do it. Don't worm them, let them have 2 weeks, then send them out. And there's a bit of forward planning involved.
Yeah, okay. It's time to get started on that, really. Yeah,
it is absolutely, classic. I mean, certainly the Glastonbury herds, you're on about ordering lungworm vaccine now in February, because it'll take a couple of weeks to arrive, and then you arrive 2 doses 4 weeks apart with then a break. It is now, which is why I really wanted to mention it. February is the time when you think about these things. Just one final point before we, sorry, Jamie, go on.
I'm just watching the clock a little bit, so yep. I've got a couple of questions here that I'd like to ask before we finish. So I'll let you carry on, yes. James, but I've got a couple more for you.
No, okay, yeah, good, because we're last slide is next. The only thing I was going to ask Richard again before we summarise was, was there anything you were working towards eradicating? Did you have a sort of a long-term view about getting rid of IVR? You're clearly well down the road of BVD free. Did you have a thought about getting rid of IVR, for example?
Yeah, if we could get rid of IVR, but whether that's a challenge too far because of, we're stock heavy in this area, I suppose that's almost as depending on what everybody else in this area does as well, I suppose, isn't it? It's got to be, if it's coming by aerosol from down the way, then, we all need to be doing it to help ourselves, really, isn't it?
It is. I mean, certainly IVR virus is fairly short. It's not like foot and mouth or some other things. But you're right. I mean, it's an interesting point you raise about the altruistic sort of nature, and and sort of what other farms do that are very closely sort of situated to yours. Actually, for some things, it is important to take a sort of group approach towards these things. Yes, and there's great interest in. Like when blue tongue happened, for example, what would happen if something else suddenly turned up on our shores coming over from Northern Europe? At what point? And there's research. Naomi at University of Nottingham is working on this, and some really interesting thoughts about, what's the tipping point for farms? How close would, a new disease have to get? 100 miles away, 50 miles away? 200 miles away before people actually said, I really think we need to, do something about this. But yeah, good. I'm conscious, Jamie said, time is against us as always. The last slide for Richard and I was very much a bit of a summary, that we wanted to get across to everyone on the call. Please do consider the role of a vaccine product. What are you trying to achieve with it? We talked about in the face of an outbreak. We talked about as a central pillar of control. We talked about as part of a package, perhaps, but other things are more important, for example, the environment and feeding. And we talked about insurance. So these sort of pigeonholes, we really wanted to bang the drum about storage. And you heard Richard there talking about, maintaining the cold chain, having the cool bag, having the cool box, and really making sure that the fridges on farm are temperature checked and not leaving the door open all the time. Following the data sheet, really, really important to do. And I'm afraid, a good chunk of farmers, 25% for Liz Cresswell's work, tended not to follow the data sheet, and that may well affect efficacy. There's great interest in using vaccines to reduce antibiotic use, and to bring the antibiotic use into play. So 2 examples where, yes, vaccination to reduce antibiotic use, because not always actually, and I know it's very tempting to throw vaccines around and say, well, as long as we vaccinate, we must be reducing antibiotic use. But there's 2 really nice examples. Calf health from a BVD and IVR point of view. So if you can get rid of BVD from your calf population and control the IVR, those are 2 things that will clearly have a massive impact on calf health. And just listen to Richard talking now about adult cow respiratory disease from a lungworm point of view. Of course, cows with reinfection syndrome, cows with lungworm, they can often have secondary pneumonia, and you end up having to give them, the oxytets, the engies, whatever, and prop them up with antibiotic and anti-inflammatory, because they will become very unwell. So there's 2 nice examples, BVD, IVR, lungworm, where you would want to control these to reduce the use to use antibiotic. Buying and selling animals that are vaccinated, unvaccinated, we haven't touched. I mean, it's such a big topic. We haven't touched on sourcing and incoming stock, but clearly if you are buying animals, are they vaccinated or are they unvaccinated and potentially coming into a unit, for example, Richard's, where we know there's IVR endemically in Richard's herd, You know, if you bought in a naive heifer that wasn't vaccinated for IBR, she could become infected. And the strategy for lungworm control, and really interesting to hear Richard talking about environmental impact of wormers. You know, this and lungworm control, I think, always on the agenda, particularly for very grazing focused herds, and particularly with climate change, you know, weather change. We're having some very, very hot, dry spells. All the lungworm larvae will be locked up in the dung, and then it'll chuck it down with rain in September and October, but still stay warm, and you can have big challenge with lungworm certain times of the year. So that was our summary, Jamie. You know, thank you very much, Richard. It was really interesting to chat to you again. And Jamie, back to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I have got a couple of questions that have come in, particularly about the purchasing and selling of animals, actually, James, if you wouldn't mind. So
Okay.
someone's asking, when you've bought something in and, you know, the seller tells you that it's vaccinated, would you recommend starting the process again in order to sync them with your own herd? Or can you stretch it so that the booster's just done at the same time as yours? What would you do practically?
It depends on the disease, I guess, doesn't it? I suppose if you talk about a BVD situation, for example, if you bought something in, even though there was a history of vaccination, I would still want to know it wasn't persistently infected, because it could be. So for those sorts of things, you'd still blood test it and check it was antigen negative, for example. In the case of then aligning it with the herd, well, then it depends. If there's evidence of big challenge within the herd, I would want to probably get on and booster it sooner rather than later, if it had been for a while. If you didn't have evidence of high challenge, well, then it's probably fine to let it run on and align it with the rest of the cows. You know, but it's very dependent on individual disease. I think the most important thing is probably, just because it has been vaccinated, still make sure it isn't a PI. You know, still do your screening as you would normally, you know, because for the reasons we've sort of talked about, it may have been vaccinated, but the thing might have been in 30 degrees heat for 2 hours before you actually vaccinated the animal in the first place. So, you know.
Yeah. From my perspective, vaccinate it and let it run into vaccinate it when you buy them, and then get them, let them fall into your booster program. That's what I would do.
Yeah.
Fab, thanks very much. And then there's the last one I've got for you, which I think is actually a really good practical one. How safe are staff, humans, people, when they're using vaccines? Should they be wearing PPE?
Good question, actually. So wearing gloves, I think, is always a good idea. I mean, I think some of these, and I mean, it actually extends to quite a lot of things, doesn't it? You know, not only vaccines, but, you know, famously, you know, some of the antibiotics, the tilmicocin macrolide antibiotic, you know, was actually incredibly dangerous if you accidentally injected yourself with it. You know, the Scabivax Orth one. Generally speaking, I'm not aware there's many operator health warnings with a lot of these, but that's not to say, you know, particularly live vaccines with adjuvants, they'd be quite irritant and nasty if you accidentally injected yourself with it, you know, and so I think wearing gloves particularly, and making sure, you know, we're not leaving needles lying around, is very good practice.
Yeah, I just add to that then is to make it as safe as possible, you know, handling facilities for those cows when you run them through the race, make sure everything's up to date. You know, I know it's off point a bit, but we've got sheep and we use foot vax. Now that's very, very dangerous if you inject yourself then, because there's an oil-based product, and there aren't many of those in the cows. But yeah, just be safe and just keep the cows safe and yourself safe, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I would add to that, giving yourself adequate time to do the job, because there's nothing worse than rushing. That's when good practice goes out the window, isn't it? So yeah, so thanks for that question. I think really the final word, someone has been generous enough to share a little bit of a horror story, actually, that they've experienced, but they had an IBR outbreak after stray cows broke into their farm. So they've explained that they were a closed herd for 20 years and were double fenced. And it was devastating. They lost cows. They had to nasal spray the whole herd overnight. And the vaccine did kick in, and they now vaccinate every year, but it's taken a considerable amount of time to get over that outbreak. And they are just saying, you know, really recommend doing it. But I think that's one of those stories where it's just a lesson learned, isn't it? Nobody wants that to happen to them. And, you know, my heart goes out to you that it happened to you, but thanks for sharing, because we can all learn from, you know, even the best biosecurity. Nothing's invincible, is it? So I guess a vaccination is an extra level of biosecurity and extra insurance policy, which really sums up what we've been talking about today. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone, for your time today. Richard, James, thanks very much for, you know, sharing your experience, expertise and story. It is really great when we can all learn from, you know, real farms, real case studies, and that's what the Strategic Dairy Farm's all about. And I think the joy of being on a webinar is that we don't have to jump in the car and all travel for however long to get to the farm. But regardless, we look forward to doing so at the next opportunity, Richard, and coming out to Maenhir and seeing it all in the flesh, and yeah, putting the wellies on and having a look at.
Yeah, thank you to everyone, and thank you for listening, really.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I really enjoyed meeting Richard last year. It was a pleasure, and it'd be great to see you again. I'll bring the Welsh cakes.
We'll hold you to that. Right, so just a couple of final notices then. For those people who are listening in Wales, Farming Connect have got some amazing opportunities at the moment to help people go on study visits. So if you're a Welsh farmer and you're able to benefit from the Farming Connect study tours, then I would highly recommend. They've also got Zoom around the world. And their next upcoming webinar is the 15th of February, and they're talking about grazing and nutrient management. So that's surely another one not to miss. And my final reminder is just that the AHDB opportunity to have your say is happening this spring. We really want to hear how people would like AHDB to proceed. So please do, if you're a levy payer, register to have your vote. You can go onto our website in order to find the registration link, but honestly, it takes probably less than a minute once you've found the link. So really worthwhile doing, can't emphasize enough. And with that, we'll say thank you very much for your time today, and see you next time.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.